There's some times when I've been at some like really cool events, or you're standing in front of the door that says Dwayne Johnson on it or Meryl Streep on it, and you're about to do that interview. It's important to just like take a breath and like remember this moment. Like take this moment and put this in a little compartment in your brain that you don't forget, because life moves really fast. And if you don't stop and smell those roses and stop and appreciate those moments, they're gone. They're gone forever, no matter what. But if you can remember those moments, you can at least go back and like relive them and appreciate how cool they were.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by TrueFan. Before we get into today's conversation with Chris Van Vliet, there's a couple things that we need to go over first. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider leaving us a positive rating and review. Share this episode with a friend and subscribe to the show. I put up brand new interviews every single Monday, and a brand new takeaways episode is an audio exclusive where I sit down and break down the most recent podcast episode of the week every single Thursday. And now, without further ado, I am very excited to present to you my conversation with Chris Van Vliet. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by TrueFan. Today on the show, we are joined by a 4-time Emmy Award-winning TV host, entertainment reporter, and YouTuber, Chris Van Vliet. Chris has traveled the world reporting for events like the Oscars, Grammys, and the Cannes Film Festival. This has led him to interviewing Hollywood A-listers like Oprah Winfrey, Tom Cruise, and Will Smith. On top of that, he's a die-hard professional wrestling fan. He's interviewed some of the top superstars in all of sports entertainment, including John Cena, The Rock, and Hulk Hogan. I'm very excited to have him here on the podcast today to discuss how he went from Pickering, Ontario, to the red carpet, to the squared circle, and beyond. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jacob.
I'm excited to have you here. And where I want to start today, I want to go all the way back to the beginning. I want to go back to Pickering. Talk to me about growing up there. I'm assuming there was time spent. What's it called? I wrote down here, Movieplex 9 or something like that. Was there time spent there?
Love Movieplex 9, of course.
Yeah. And so what were you like growing up?
I was very athletic. So I think that was where, it began for me. And I played a ton of sports. Baseball was the first sport I played. Started when I was 5 playing t-ball. It was hockey a few years later. Then as I got into sports in school, I played literally every sport that was possible. In my elementary school, we had basketball and volleyball. So I tried out and played both of those. Track and field, cross country. Like, believe it or not, I was somehow the guy who won like the 100-meter dash and the 200-meter dash when I was like 10 and 11 years old, which was crazy. And when I got into high school, it was wrestling and I was on the baseball team. So sports very much dictated a lot of my life growing up. And a lot of my friends were from the sports that I played. But I had a really, really early passion for broadcasting and loved broadcasting. In fact, one of my earliest memories is I had a Fisher-Price tape recorder, like with cassette tapes. And I would pretend to be the radio host that I heard on the radio. And I would mimic them and record them on these little cassette tapes. And who knew that one day that would end up being like a part of my job?
Toronto Blue Jays, play-by-play guys, were those some of the guys you covered back in the day?
Of course. Yeah. Tom Cheek and Jerry Howarth. Like, I remember it distinctly. Like, I would be like, welcome again to Blue Jays baseball. We're on the air. Hello again, everybody. I'm Jerry. Yeah, that was the whole thing. I remember doing that all the time. And my dad, still to this day, my dad would rather listen to the radio, listen to the baseball games, Blue Jay games on the radio than watch it on TV, which is so funny. And I remember there were times when I'd be watching it in the living room on the TV and my dad would be outside listening to it on the radio. And the radio feed was a little bit faster than the TV feed. And he'd be like, oh, yeah. And then 4 seconds later, I'd be like, oh, there it is. Oh, okay.
And what do you think it was about broadcasting from the age of 4 that just sucked you in?
I thought that's a great question. And I'm not quite sure if I know specifically what it was, but I always loved the idea of presenting. And I love the idea of being able to tell stories and evoke an emotion out of someone. And early on, I was part of different plays at my church or in my school. And when I got into high school, I was the vice president of my student council and I did the morning announcements. I hosted the talent show, hosted the fashion show. Just being able to have that mic in my hand And knowing that everybody was looking at me, waiting for that response was something that I just always loved. And I knew it was a long shot, especially growing up in Canada. I knew it was a long shot to be on television, but I wanted to give it a try and I wanted to give my all to that. And if it didn't work out, at least I could say I tried.
And in high school too, your communications class, I believe it was, you put on like a weekly news show or something like that as well?
Yeah, which was so like I think back now of like how formidable that class was and those years were for me. I mean, the name alone, communication studies, does not tell you you're going to make television. Like if they called that class TV and film or TV and radio, there'd be a line out the door to take that class. Calling it communication studies, I don't know, it's like this little, it's a secret like fun class. But yeah, in communication studies, I took it in grade 11 and grade 12. And in grade 11, we had basically like a news setup. So we had two news anchors that would read the same script every single show that we did. And then you rotated around the different positions in the control room. So then you were a camera person, then you were a floor director, audio, VTR, all these different roles that would actually do exist in an actual control room. And then in 12th grade, we would write out different TV segments. We would write a 3-minute segment, like a script for it. Then we'd write out a 30-second commercial. We'd get in these small groups of like 5 or 6 people. We'd all submit ours in. And within that group, we would pick, all right, this is the best script for a segment. And this is the best script for a commercial. Every small group went out, spent the entire week shooting it, editing it, putting it all together. And then on Friday, we compiled it together into a TV show that was called The Fifth Period. And it was just so cool to think that here we are at 15, 16 years old, actually doing it in the real world. Like, this is before YouTube, this is before social media. And here we were being content creators.
Yeah, and that school was it Pine Ridge? Is that what it's called?
Yes, Pine Ridge Secondary School, which, fun fact, is the same place where Shawn Mendes went.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, and I was watching the recent Shawn Mendes documentary on Netflix, and I was like, that's my high school. He never specifically said it, but I'm like, I know that place.
That's awesome. And you mentioned how like high school is just there's such formidable years. And
Yeah.
when I think of Chris Van Vliet, I think of three things. I think of bass fishing, broadcasting, and wrestling. And those three things were very central to your experience in high school. Like we've talked about the broadcasting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you kept your fishing rod in your locker so you could go fishing at lunch after school, right?
Dude, look how much research you've done. Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, look, those are 3 things that I'm like super passionate about. And the things that I'm passionate about, I'm all the way in on them. That's just my personality type. So, yeah, fishing, broadcasting, and pro wrestling as well. But fishing was like a huge, huge thing that really drove me. So, I talked about all the sports that I played growing up. There actually became a point in my life when I was like, just starting to get that little bit of freedom that you get, when your parents allow you to, go out on your own with your friends. That was like 12, 13, 14 years old. Obviously, you don't have your driver's license at that point, but you have a bike. And when you have a bike, you've got a ton of freedom. And where I grew up, we were really close to a few different creeks or bays, or really close to Lake Ontario. So we were able to go fishing, and bass was something that I loved. I loved bass fishing. And because we had these rivers that flowed into Lake Ontario in the spring, the steelhead or rainbow trout would run up the creeks to spawn. And then in the fall, you'd have the salmon that would run up the creeks to spawn. So our high school backed on to Duffin's Creek. And there was a little section of that creek that was about a 5-ish minute walk from our school, or like very quick, brisk walk because our lunch break was only 40 minutes long. But yeah, I would run down there with one of my best friends, Basil. We would go down, and for a few weeks of the year, you could catch salmon right where your school was. So I'd catch them in the creek there, and then, yeah, I would go back to school like stinking like Chinook salmon.
Is that creek? Because I know is that the creek that was downstream from a nuclear power plant, or was that somewhere else?
It was close. So there's the Pickering nuclear power plant, which is what Pickering's known for, which is crazy. And I fished a lot at the nuclear power plant, which, without getting too deep into the weeds here, in the winter, they would have this warm water outflow out of the nuclear power plant. So the water that was right around the power plant was 5, 10, maybe even 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the lake. So all these fish would go in there. So I fished there a lot, but We were Duffins Creek was just a little bit, like maybe a few kilometers away from there, and still some of the best salmon and steelhead fishing in all of Ontario there.
Mhm. And so the other, so we've covered broadcasting, fishing, now pro wrestling. And so I know you really got into pro wrestling around 15, but kind of the impetus of that, the foundation was at your grandparents on Saturdays, right? You'd go over and to be on the TV there.
Yeah, I mean, and just my grandparents like just loved watching sports. My grandpa in particular, my deado. So my mom was actually born in Greece. My mom's first language was Macedonian. And so my grandma and grandpa on that side are Baba and Dedo. And they live in Scarborough, Ontario. And we would go visit them like every weekend, as one does. You'd go and visit your family members. And sports would just always be on the TV as I was growing up. So in the late 80s, I would have been 5, 6, 7 years old, early 90s, a little bit older than that. And if hockey wasn't on, of course, growing up in Canada, a lot of hockey on TV. But if hockey wasn't on or baseball wasn't on, sometimes football was on. But if those weren't on, Saturday night, pro wrestling would be on. And it's not like my grandpa was a huge fan, but he just wanted, that entertainment on TV. So that's when I like first got interested in it and aware of it. And we're talking about like Junkyard Dog, Repo Man, Coco Beware, Ultimate Warrior, Macho Man, like so early 90s. That's kind of like those are the people I was aware of. But then it was in the late 90s when like I was really aware of what it was and became like a huge fan. Like we're talking about like the height of the Attitude Era. And it was Austin McMahon was the big storyline at the time. And that's what just like sucked me into it. And I went from watching no wrestling to watching literally every single wrestling show possible within the course of like a week. It was just like that.
Well, because so correct me if I'm wrong, but how that switch got flipped was you used to call your buddy on the phone, and every Monday you had to be off the phone at 9. You decided one day to you'd stick through and watch the wrestling on the phone with him, and then you were just hooked after that, right?
Yeah, and the funny thing about this to tie it all together here is that was my buddy Vince, who was also like one of my fishing friends. Like we became, man, I was playing hockey with this other, well, like a bunch of teammates, but this one guy named Terry who was like, "Oh, I've been fishing down at the Toronto Islands." And I'm like, "Oh, tell me more. I hear the fishing's great there." And he goes, "Oh, well, one day, we can go down, me and you and my buddy Vince." And I went, "Sure, sounds good." We ended up going fishing at the Toronto Islands, which the fishing was incredible there. A lot of great northern pike fishing. Man, we're going deep into the weeds of the fishing talk here. And I ended up becoming better friends with Vince because he was just as hardcore about fishing as I was. And Vince and I became like really good friends. And you're right. Again, thank you for doing so much great research here. Vince and I would talk on the phone all the time because that's what you did in the late 90s. You didn't text, and didn't exist. You didn't have social media. You didn't have instant messenger. So we would talk on the phone all the time. And yeah, Monday night at 9 o'clock, Raw would come on TSN, and our call would abruptly come to an end. And there was one Monday when we just weren't done talking about what we were talking about. And I said, "All right, man, I know how badly you need to watch wrestling. I'll put it on and, I'll watch along with you. And then the next commercial break, like we can finish up what we were talking about." And when I put it on, I just got sucked into it. And I don't know what it was specifically. I know that it was Austin McMahon was the big storyline at the time. I don't know what it was specifically, but I just loved the athleticism of it. I loved how the charisma just oozed out of these people. No matter which character they were, there was just so much charisma. And I was sucked in. And when I'm passionate about something, I dive all the way in. I don't check the temperature of the water. I don't check the depth of the waters. Boom, I'm all the way in on it. And that's how I was about wrestling. And I very quickly went from not even really being a fan to we were part of a backyard wrestling league, like not long after that.
I'm curious about the career of Chris Sharp. Can you kind of walk me through how this backyard wrestling federation came together and like what that whole thing looked like?
So what we had a group of friends who would walk home from high school together. And one of our friends had a trampoline. So when you're 15 years old, a trampoline is not just a trampoline. A trampoline is basically a wrestling ring. So I just started getting into watching wrestling. And every single time we went to our friend Becca's house and jumped on the trampoline, it wasn't just jumping, it was rock bottoms and stone cold stunners. And we learned that DDT is a really easy move to give and receive. So that's what we started doing. And then a friend of a friend had this backyard wrestling federation. And at the time, we're talking in the year 2000, backyard wrestling, especially on the internet, was a huge, huge blossoming thing. So they were like kind of doing some moves in the backyard. And Greg, who ends up, one of my best friends now, I officiated his wedding. He had like some gym mats because his father was a custodian at a local high school. So he had some gym mats in his backyard and like some folding tables. And we put this together and we're like, I think we've got something here. And, fast forward a few weeks, and the next thing you know, like someone has a video camera, another friend like knows somebody at a trophy store. So we've got a belt made for our company. Like we had a pretty legitimate backyard wrestling federation called the HCW. And yeah, my character was Chris Sharp, who is like your classic heel. He didn't like anybody and nobody liked him. Sharp talking, sharp walking, sharp dressing. That's who Chris Sharp was. And I was, because I had some background as a high school wrestler, because I was athletic and played some sports, I was very like confident in my abilities. And like, it's wrestling. So, it's not about like who's better or who's worse. It's just like, who are we going to book to be the champion? Who's going to win the matches? And I was like, well, I think Chris Sharp should be our champion here. And so Chris Sharp's career was a 2-time champion in the HCW. And he had some great feuds with people like Rage and Mark Mayhem and Danny Courageous.
That's
so
amazing.
ridiculous reliving all this.
Do those videos still exist somewhere on the internet?
On the internet, probably not. But on my old computer or on like a hard drive, yes. Like in very bad, it's a terrible quality. They also exist on some VHS tapes. So I have them. I think they're at my parents' house, and my friend Greg has them at his place. So yes, they still exist somewhere. I mean, they were great 20 years ago when we recorded them. I'm sure they're awful now. But I take great pride in the fact that a lot of the backyard wrestling that existed at the time was like the super hardcore backyard wrestling, barbed wire and thumbtacks and fire, like ridiculous stuff. Like, what are you doing putting yourself through a flaming door for the 6 people that are watching this? So I really took pride in the fact that we were more technically based. I mean, I look back now and I realize we had no clue what we were doing. But I take pride in the fact that we weren't hitting each other with barbed wire baseball bats like some other federations were.
Yeah. No, I can remember. I mean, it probably would have been 7, 8 years after you guys had finished your wrestling federation, but I can remember watching clips on YouTube of backyard wrestling all the time in middle school and stuff like that. But you pursued wrestling even further than that because you were in wrestling school in college. I believe between your second and third year, you were driving an hour away to go to wrestling school.
Yeah. And like I'd made an agreement with my friend Greg, whose, backyard we were doing the backyard wrestling in, that when we graduated from high school and we had the money and had the means to do it, we were doing this. Like this was our pact. We were going to go to wrestling school. And I ended up keeping up my end of the bargain. And he was going to teachers college at the time and just didn't have the funds, couldn't make it work. Ironically, though, a few years later, one of our friends, Will, ended up not only training, but becoming a pretty successful backyard wrestler, independent wrestler in Ontario. He went by the name Will White / Bill Black. And I was just really proud of the fact that he did end up pursuing that. But yeah, I went to Wilfrid Laurier University and I was so passionate about wrestling. And it was just, it was an itch that I needed to scratch. And I ended up signing up for the Squared Circle. It's a wrestling school in Toronto. And it was about a 30 to 40-minute drive from where I was living in Pickering. I was living in Pickering in the summer. And my summer job was working at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. So these were long days. Like I started work at Enterprise Rent-A-Car at 7:30 in the morning, was done work at 6. Wrestling school started at 7. I think it was 7 to 10. So these were long days. And I realized when it was time to go back to school, back to university, that I had like kind of a crossroads here. Wrestling school is now an hour drive away, $250 a month, which is a ton of money when you're in college. So I had to decide, like, was I going to go to school and focus on my communication studies degree, or was I going to focus on wrestling school and pursue that dream? And I kind of decided at that moment that wrestling would always be there. I could go to wrestling school at 20, I could go at 30, I could go to any age. And my communication studies degree was right here, right now, it was right in front of me, and I should focus on that. And I'm really happy that I'm able to have the communication studies degree, work in broadcasting, and now dip my toe into the wrestling world kind of when I want to.
Okay. And I'm it's like, so on top of going to school, I'm curious because you've done like to your point, diving headfirst into your passions and kind of diving and fully committing on
Yeah.
top of school, where you found time during college to be in a band.
I mean, in college, I mean, you have time to do whatever it is that you want to do. It's what's the most important thing that you want to focus on. But yeah, we had just it was kind of just a silly joke band at first where I play guitar. My buddy Pat is the best. He can play every instrument. And he did play every instrument in our band. And my friend Greg, who is also the guy whose backyard we were doing the backyard wrestling in, was our lead singer. And so was our friend Trev. So there was four of us. And we were just kind of jamming out in Pat's basement, as one does. You know, this is what people do when they're in college. And I thought, like, we're onto something here. Like, we've created something that has a pretty distinct sound. And this is 2002 and three. And I said, I think we sound like a the band. And this is the time of like the Hives, the Strokes, the White Stripes, like all that stuff. And I said, we're a the band. And we kind of like thought about this for a while. We're like, no, we're not a the band. We are the band. That's what we ended up calling ourselves, the band, which I think when you think back, how popular could you really be when you're calling yourself the band? I mean, we probably should have thought of something a little bit more catchy or original, but dude, we recorded like 30 plus songs probably, which I think if you go to myspace.com/the band Canada, I think you can still hear some of our stuff.
All right. I might have to jump on there and check that out after we finish up here.
These
See if I
are
could.
very raw, very grungy, like garage sound like recordings, but I'm really proud of what we did. And I don't know if I dove into that as much as I could have because we were all working in very different places. We all had crazy different schedules, very different interests. This was just a fun thing. Like there's something about music that it unites people when you're listening to it, but it unites people that much more when you're creating it together. So it was just a magical thing that like we'll always be able to share with each other.
I'm curious where, because as you're talking here, most people when they talk about the things they did in high school, the things they did in college, they almost look back at them and cringe. But every time we talk about, like we talk about the backyard wrestling, we talk about the band, you talk about looking back at them fondly and like proudly with everything you did. I'm curious how you're able to do that because so many people aren't able to do that.
Oh, don't I mean, I cringe. I'm like fully cringing at all of this stuff, but I'm also aware that that's what made me who I am today. Like, I look back at some of these backyard wrestling videos, and this is 2000 and 2001, like when frosted tips were like a popular thing. So I look back at those videos and I had like yellow hair on top, like awful, totally cringe at that. In fact, I reposted it on Instagram the other day and like, just a slew of people just laughing at me. I'm like, yeah, no, I get it. I embrace it. That's the fact. That's who I was. But I think, Jacob, you have to embrace who you were because it's who you are now. It's helped you become who you are now. And I don't live with any sort of regrets about any of the stuff that I did or didn't do back then because it's led me to exactly where I am right now.
Mhm. And speaking of kind of leading to where you are right now, you had an epiphany at, I think, believe your senior year that you realized that after this, life is really starting. Like you're going to be 40 years plus of working. I don't know if you necessarily thought you'd be exactly where you are right now, but you knew you'd be working in some capacity for the next 40 years. Can you kind of talk to me about how that epiphany happened, like where and when that realization came to you?
Yeah, and it was like a really life-changing moment too. I remember it specifically. I had such a good time in my college years, my university years. I lived with four of my best friends, and we went to school in Waterloo, Ontario, which for people who, aren't familiar, that's like the college town in Ontario, if not Canada. You've got two universities and a college in this one little town. And everything in Waterloo is basically centered around do you go to Wilfrid Laurier? Do you go to Waterloo? Or do you go to Conestoga College? Because everything there is like centered around students. So I was having the best time there. I really enjoyed the classes that I was taking. I've such a big place in my heart for Wilfrid Laurier. It is such a great school. My time there was so enjoyable. And I think that when I entered my fourth year, I think I was starting to get nostalgic about the fact that this was about to end. And I was already like dreading the fact that this amazing, incredible chapter of my life was about to end. And then I started to think about like, what's on the other side of this? Oh, what's on the other side of this is working for the rest of your life. And I started to think about that in the terms of like, I mean, how could you possibly fathom what the rest of your life is, right? Like at that point in my life, I'd only been alive for 21 years. How could I fathom what another 40 or 50 on top of that would feel like? But I started to think to myself, all right, well, when we graduate at the end of this year, if all of this fun has to come to an end, what are we going to do next? And that was when I started to like set my life up, or at least try to stack the odds in my favor and stack the deck, so that when I did graduate, I could at least have the odds in my favor to try to get a job that I enjoyed. And my whole thing and this whole epiphany was I didn't want to be one of those people who hated going to work every day. I didn't want to be one of those people who hated Sunday because Monday was the next day. So I reached out to every radio station in Waterloo, every TV station in Waterloo, and just basically said, I'm a broadcasting student, I'm a communication studies major. I am so passionate about broadcasting. Can I come in and volunteer and just see how it's done in the real world? I wanted to see like, how is the sausage made? I kind of had an idea. I took a tour of Global Television in Toronto when I was a kid, but I wanted to see how the sausage was made. And one radio station got back to me and said, yeah, for sure. Come in, be part of our street team. And I was like, this is amazing. And I got to like watch them do the live remotes. And then Rogers Community Television said, absolutely. We take on volunteers all the time. Come on in. Let us know when you're available and you're welcome to come in. And just like my communication studies class, I got to work behind the scenes doing all those same jobs I did in high school, now in the real world, where there were actual, like results where like if I pointed the camera in the wrong direction, that's what you saw on TV. But I was at Rogers Community Television as a camera operator, VTR, floor director. It was just so much fun. And they put me on the air for like 6 seconds there, which was such a cool experience. And then 570 News, which is a radio station in Kitchener, they said, well, we don't take on volunteers, but how would you like a job? And I went up, yeah, okay. They said it only pays $8. I said, that's $8 more than I thought I was going to make. And they brought me in to be a board operator. So I was working the soundboard for different talk shows, different news broadcasts. And then when my shift was done, I would go into the recording studio and I would record the scripts of the day so that I had like a demo reel that I could show for my work. And it was in those experiences where I realized I was learning so much more in the real world than I was learning in my classes at school. And that is not a knock on my classes, but I was learning so much more like tangible things that I was like, I want more of this. And there were even points where like I was skipping class to go work at the radio station because I knew that it was better experience for me.
And so was 570 News and Chex TV, those are two separate things. Chex TV was Peterborough.
Yeah.
And when you said you reached out to all these places, it wasn't just like you looked them up in the phone book. Like I'm pretty sure one of the places you like scoured the internet and found the manager's email address or something like that, right?
So that's how I ended up right when I was about to graduate. That's how I ended up getting my first TV gig. That was at Chex TV in Peterborough. And Peterborough is about an hour away from Pickering. And I just kind of knew that I needed an internship when I graduated because an internship might lead to a job, or at least might lead to me having a demo reel. So I could say, hey, look at all the stuff I've done on TV. Please hire me somewhere. I'm okay at this thing, or at least I think I'm okay at this thing. And I would reach out to all these different places for internships and no one even got back to me. And I ended up, you're right, scouring the internet to find the general manager's email at Chex TV, which was it's a pretty small market. It's a pretty small TV station. And I basically lied to him. I sent him an email and said, I'm going to be in Peterborough for reading week next week. Could I come by and talk to you about a possible internship? And he basically wrote back like, yeah, if you're going to be in town, sure, come on by. We can talk. Again, like total lie, hadn't been to Peterborough in like 10 years, had no plans to be there. But because he said, "Yeah, let's do it." I drove up there and he looked at my resume and it was filled with all of the things that I'd been doing over the last 6-ish months with the volunteer positions, this radio job that I had. And he said, "We don't usually do this, but yeah, what the heck? We'll take a chance on you." And I became an intern there. And my internship was basically following around the reporters as they did their job. And in a small station, the reporters do everything. They write the stories, they shoot the stories, they edit the stories, produce them, all of that. And 2 weeks into my story, or 2 weeks into my internship, the assignment editor hands me a story. He goes, "Here's your story for the day." I said, "Oh, cool. Like, which reporter am I going out with today?" He said, "You're going out with Terry, but this is your story. You're going to be on the 6 o'clock news tonight." And I went, "What?" It's like, "Yeah, absolutely. This is your story." And 2 weeks into my internship, this shifted from me basically watching them do their job to me now doing the job and being on the news every night. Like, what an incredible, amazing opportunity that I had in my hands here. So that's what my internship turned into, me being basically like a student reporter for them. And it was amazing and it was fun. And I was working my old high school job at the pet store. I worked in the fish department of PJ's Pet Center. So I could pay for the gas to drive to my internship where I was obviously not being paid. And then after a few months of that, I went to my general manager, the same guy who had given me this opportunity. And I said, "Thank you so much for this opportunity." He's like, "I'm going to stop you right there. We love what you've been doing. You are such a great reporter for us. We don't have a position for you, but we've created one. So yeah, you're not going to be an intern anymore. Starting next week, you're going to be a reporter." And I'm like, "What? I was coming up here to quit." And he's like, "Well, good, quit. Great. You're not an intern anymore. You're now a reporter."
That's amazing. Bring me back to that first when they first hand you that story and you're caught off guard. How does it go when you're on camera, you're on air, 2 weeks into your internship? How does that story go for you?
Pretty awful. I mean, pretty awful. I was so caught off guard because I didn't know that I would be doing this. I'd done, in those 2 weeks of my internship up to that point, I had like held the camera a little bit. I had kind of learned how to tell a story, but I hadn't been like in front of the camera. And it was a high school track and field meet at like a local school. And I was with Terry Doyle, who's a very accomplished reporter and a great storyteller. And I was just kind of like, "Okay, what should I do, Terry?" And he's like, "It's your story. What do you want to do?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And he's like, "Well, you better figure it out. Like, we've got about an hour to shoot here. We've got about an hour drive back, and then you've got to edit it." I'm like, "What? I have to edit this too?" And it was basically just like you're thrown to the wolves. And I've watched the story back, maybe not that recently, but I've watched it back over the last handful of years. It's awful. It's terrible. But I also realize that we all have to start somewhere. So I think the nerves of that story really helped me, kind of form who I was as a reporter, form who I was as a storyteller. And the more that I did it, the better I got at it.
And that's the reason I asked that story, because I don't think there's been a reporter ever that's just gone on air for the first time and crushed it like they've been in the business for 20 years, right? Like everybody has to start at that ground level and work their way up. And even if it's the worst story that's ever been done, that means that the second story is going to be better no matter what. So that's why I
Yes.
asked that.
Yeah, and the thing about television in general is you're only as good as your last story. And I think that it's important to realize that, yeah, while this one might not be great, this one might not be awesome, that's okay. You can go on to the next one. And the cool thing was, this was 2005 when I was doing this. So this is pre-YouTube. And television news pretty much existed in a bubble at that time and it existed in a vacuum. So like it went out into the world and then that was it. Like nobody had a phone to record their TV. Nobody had it was putting the clip on YouTube or Instagram. If it sucked in that moment and no one really remembered it. So that was actually kind of like a blessing in disguise.
Fair enough. And then it was 2 weeks into that internship you get on the air. And then I believe 2 years after that, you're out in Vancouver interviewing celebrities, right?
Not even. Yeah. It was like, I think I spent 17 months at Chex TV. And I loved the opportunities I was given there, but I also knew I was 22 years old at the time. And I knew that at 22 years old, I didn't want to be a news reporter for the rest of my life. I had a lot of like personality that I wanted to show off. And in news, you can really only show off personality if you're the weather guy or you're the sports guy. And where I was working at Chex TV, those positions were, untouchable. The people that were doing those jobs had been there forever. They were legends. So I kept looking at like all these opportunities that were popping up, and I would audition for other jobs and not even be considered. And I went to an open casting call for Much More Music. I was about 6 months into my time at Chex TV. And I remember like taking the day off, driving to downtown Toronto, and like going to this open casting call in like the famous Much Music building. And I went there and I filled out this like application, and I'm sitting there in this group of like all these different people. And the security guard comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, you, come with me." And I'm like, "What did I do wrong? Like, what's going on here?" I said, what's going on?" And he goes, "Oh, they wanted to see the people they're most interested in first before getting to everybody else." And at this point, I was like 178th in line. And now I've like bumped up. I'm now like the first person they're going to see. And I went back there, and there was a producer from Much More Music. And he goes, "We really like your style." And then I told him that I was currently on TV at Chex TV. He's like, "Great." And I also learned later on that like having a news background was good because you had the experience of being on TV, but also bad because you kind of like speak in news speak, like, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like news anchors, news reporters all have this like certain cadence that they speak with. And that's not really how television hosting works. So I went in, I did an audition for them like on the spot. He hands me his business card and goes, "I'm only giving my business card to people who get a call back. So send me an email on Monday and you'll come back in for like a more formal audition." I'm like, "Oh my God, like I've got what it takes to work at Much Music or Much More Music or whatever, just to be in this family at 299 Queen Street." I'm like, "This is incredible." And like that lifted my spirits so much because that was exactly what I wanted to do. I always wanted to be a TV host. And now here I was, like, this is the pinnacle of TV hosting, especially when you're in your 20s. And they wanted me. I was so excited. I went in and they basically said, "We think you might be a little bit too young for Much More Music." And then they went and introduced me at Much Music. And they're like, "Yeah, I mean, seems like you've got what it takes, but we just don't have any openings right now." And I was just like, "No, but I know that like at least I fit in this family." And then a few months later, I saw an opening for their sister station, which was Razor TV, eventually became MTV2 Canada. And they had a posting for like a host, and I met all the requirements. It was like 1 to 2 years of TV hosting experience. I was like, "Yes." Communication studies degree. I'm like, "Absolutely." I was like, "This is me." Interviewing experience. I'm like, "Oh, I've done that all the time." And because I had access at Chex TV to having a camera every day, because as a news reporter, we did everything there. After my shift, I would grab the camera, I would go out to some like random looking place, and I would film these TV segments like I was doing these entertainment bits. And I would make it look like I was reporting on entertainment news in Peterborough, Ontario. And I submitted that for this job at Razor TV in Vancouver. And I submitted it in, didn't hear back from them, but I'm like, "Oh man, I've got a feeling though, if Much More Music wanted me and I meet all the requirements for this job, I've got to get this job. I've at least got to get a chance to get this job." So I knew the name of the person that was doing the hiring because it was on the application. So I called the TV station and asked for her by name. Like I called the front desk. I said, "Is so and so there, please?" And I said, "One moment." I went, "Oh my God, this is going to work." And I left a voicemail. She emailed me right back and basically said, "We're looking at, the different applications. We'll get back to you." And in the email signature was her direct phone line. And I went, "Oh, I am going to be calling you soon." And a few days later, I called her at her desk. She answered right away. And I said, "Hey, I submitted my video to you. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. And I'm going to be in Vancouver next Thursday. I would love to just come in and chat with you about it." And it was the very same situation as the Peterborough job. "Well, if you're going to be here, you might as well come in." Again, like total lie. It's a 5-hour flight from Toronto to Vancouver. But they were like, "Well, if you're going to be here, yeah, yeah, come on by." So I ended up like booking a flight to Vancouver, going in and talking to them in person. And within 5 minutes of the conversation, we were talking about salary. And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I think I've got this job." And sure enough, they offered me the gig, and my life very quickly changed from being a news reporter in Peterborough, Ontario, to being a national TV host in Vancouver.
I'm gonna start calling that when people say I'm gonna be somewhere when they're not actually gonna be. I'm gonna start calling that the Van Vliet maneuver because I know you've done that later in your career as well. I believe to get on Deco Drive, you did the same thing, right?
Yeah, because like I think it's and I think that this works in all aspects of life. This isn't just about getting a job. It's just making yourself available. And then like if they want to say no, great. They can say no now, but make yourself available. Like put yourself in that situation and be willing to like put in the work, be willing to travel for it. And yeah, put yourself in the room.
I have a very niche Canadian entertainment question for you from that era, 2007, 2008, 2009.
Sure.
Did you ever interview the band Stereos during your time there?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Do up, let's make it happen, shawty. Do up, it's got to be now.
Those are the what's. Those are
Yeah.
the guys. I was
Summer
curious
girl.
because 100%. I remember like I had their lead singer on here recently because they just started putting music out again.
What?
Yeah, but they were like, I loved them. I was probably like 11 or 12 when they were making their music, when they were exploding. And so I would have been right around that time. So I was just curious if you interviewed them at like their peak, at their height back in the day.
I interviewed them when I was working in Toronto. I interviewed them in like 2008. In fact, they had just done an interview at Much Music. I met them at Much Music. We walked across the street to some random alleyway that had some great graffiti behind it, and we did our interview there. And I'm a huge fan of like pop punk music and like indie pop music. And like when I first heard Summer Girl, I was like, this is it. This is my band.
Yeah, no, they were great. And so before we jump back to Toronto, when you were in Vancouver, that's when you started interviewing wrestlers, right? Because yeah, I think it was ECW came to town. You interviewed Bobby Lashley, right?
Yeah, so I did one wrestling interview there, but it was my first ever like pro wrestling interview. I mean, I had so many incredible opportunities. And like to think of the juxtaposition of going from the news interviews I was doing literally weeks before to my first day on the show was called 969. My first day was I spent a day with Chingy, the rapper Chingy. And I followed him around for the day and like saw like what's a day in the life like when you're promoting an album. So to go from like interviewing the local health inspector or something to like now interviewing like musicians and celebrities and comedians, it was just I felt like it was exactly where I was supposed to be. And then a few months later, WWE was coming to town with their ECW SmackDown tour. And I said to my boss, I said, do we ever interview wrestlers? Could we interview a wrestler? She's like, yeah, we've done that before. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get paid to interview a wrestler. This is amazing. This is like the combination of like both of my loves, like boom, coming together. And I reached out to the WWE Canada rep at the time, and they said, we're going to have Bobby Lashley in town. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is so incredible. And I did an interview with Bobby Lashley. And that was when I realized that, like, as a wrestling fan, I now had the access to be able to ask this person whatever it was that I wanted to ask them. And I could ask them about like some of my favorite matches if I wanted. And I could ask them about their morning routines, whatever I wanted. And that was exactly what I did with Bobby Lashley. Like we had this great, like in-depth conversation. And then that idea kind of followed me in every single TV station that I worked for and every single show that I worked for. It was like, wrestling's coming to town. Can we interview a wrestler? We can? Oh my gosh. And that was where if I fast forward a little bit, that's where my YouTube channel really started to grow and blossom because I would take these raw 10, 15, 20-minute interviews that you weren't seeing on TV because we could only put a tiny little snippet on TV. I would take that, I would put it on my YouTube channel, and then other wrestling fans could go, oh my gosh, I'm so happy someone finally asked this person about this.
I'm curious what like the rights with that were, right? That was one big thing that I was surprised when you're working for these stations that they just give you the whole raw interview. You're like, yeah, use it for yourself.
Well, the thing was, these were just going to go like on the cutting room floor. These were going to get deleted. So all they really cared about was what was going to show up on TV. And this was, we're talking 2011 when I started my YouTube channel. News stations didn't have YouTube channels at the time. A lot of them didn't even have Facebook pages at the time. So I was just taking these interviews that were going to basically be thrown out and going, can I just repurpose this somewhere? No one cared.
Okay. Actually, funny story with Bobby Lashley being your first interview. The first ever thing I did with professional wrestlers in like a work capacity was with Bobby Lashley. So,
No way.
yeah. So before I started my own marketing company, I worked for the Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Groups. Like they own the Red Blacks, the football team, the 67s, the hockey team, and we had a soccer team at the time. And they hosted Bound for Glory with Impact Wrestling. And so the media tour was Bobby Lashley and Eli Drake. They came to town a little early and they did a promo shoot with a couple Red Blacks players. And I had just gotten access to like my girlfriend's DSLR because we moved in together at the time. So I took her camera and I just brought it to work and I like forced my way into this promo and I took all the photos for it. And then I like forced my way and I got a press pass for Bound for Glory and I shot Bound for Glory. So I have a bunch of old photos from like 2017 of that Bound for Glory, that pay-per-view. And so Bobby Lashley was the guy I worked with the first time I worked with pro wrestlers. So I thought that was
That's
funny,
so
a funny
cool.
coincidence.
I'll never forget putting my arm around Bobby Lashley for a photo. And it was like I was hugging like a literal piece of granite. Like he's a mountain of a man.
It's insane. He's just gigantic. And yeah, man. But back to so MTV2 ends up getting acquired, right? And so they collapse the station. You're out of work for 7 months, right? Are you stressing at all during that 6-7 month period when you don't have a job?
Yeah, like huge. So let me back it up a little bit here. We were owned by Chum at the time, which Chum owned City TV. They owned a whole bunch of, huge stuff. And then they were getting acquired by CTV in this huge merger. And we were excited because we actually used to be owned by CTV. It used to be like MTV Canada back in the day. So we're like, oh my gosh, we're going to go back to the old studio, which I had never been part of. But like some of my coworkers were like, oh, that studio is amazing. It like looks out over the city. This is so exciting. So we were like basically prepping that we were going to have a new studio and a new feel. This was so exciting. And 3 or 4 weeks into this merger, we're working away at our desks. And the boss comes in and goes, hey, everybody, stop what you're doing. Oh, okay, let's stop what we're doing. Said, yeah, we don't have a show anymore. And I went, what? Said, yeah, they decided with the merger that they're not going to move forward with our show. I was like, oh my, what do we do? And I just moved my entire life. I'd picked up my entire life, put it in my 1995 Toyota Corolla, driven 47 hours across the country to start this new life. And here I was a year into it, and it was being like basically pulled out from underneath me. And I had to figure it out pretty quickly. I had 30 days until my lease was up, and I had to decide like, all right, am I going to stay in Vancouver and try to find a job here? Or am I going to go back to Toronto where there's probably more TV jobs? And I had to decide that pretty quickly. And I decided I was going to move back to Toronto. And yeah, I mean, I was 2.5 years into my career at this point, and things were going pretty well. And again, there's not a ton of jobs on TV when you live in Canada. So I'm like, now there's even less jobs because the show that we were on just got canceled. So I started applying for these different hosting jobs and I would audition and I'd be like the final 2 or the final 3 or the final 5 and I just wouldn't get the jobs. And it was so frustrating. And I also felt like I was getting a little bit rusty because I just come from being on TV every single day to now I'm not on TV at all. I reached out to some agencies in the US because I thought if I can't get a job in Canada, my own country, I'm at least going to try to get something in the US. And I reached out to this agency called Ken Linder and Associates in LA. And I said, hey, I'm in LA sometimes. Next time I'm there, I'd love to meet with you. And they called me a few days later. Actually, I think I mailed them my actual like demo reel and like headshot and like this one. We were talking 2007 at this point. And they called me. I remember coming out of the gym and like having a voicemail. And I'm like, I don't know. It seems kind of shady. Are they like, do they actually want me or do they want me to just like pay them a bunch of money? And like, I don't know. I just was unsure about it. And the woman on the phone said, you mentioned that you're in LA sometimes. When's the next time you're going to be here? And I'm like, oh, I could probably be there like in the next month or so. And they said, all right, well, when you're here, let us know. We'd love to meet with you. And I ended up planning a trip as an unemployed person, like basically betting on myself. I'm going to fly to LA. I'm going to I got a hotel when I got there, just like, I'll figure this out and I'll meet with this agent. and they ended up signing me. And that gave me this huge confidence boost in the middle of like me being unemployed of like, oh my gosh, somebody wants me. There's still an opportunity here for me. So it was scary because this was what I had worked my entire life for. To be on TV was taken away very suddenly without any sort of warning. And I was collecting unemployment at the time, and I was like 2 weeks away from the unemployment running out when I ended up getting a job in Toronto hosting a show called Inside Jam on Sun TV as an entertainment host. That show was so much fun. And it was like things just started lining back up. Getting this job in Toronto, getting this agent that was based in the US. And while I was able to work in Toronto, I was also auditioning for all these jobs in LA and all these jobs in New York. And I just knew that like we were on the cusp of something happening here. And after 2 years, I ended up getting a job as an entertainment reporter in Cleveland at the CBS affiliate there. And that was like being able to move to the US, being able to like get a work visa in the US. My like first week of work, I was on the red carpet of the Oscars. Like I really felt like, oh my gosh, like things are really starting to take off now.
And so, talk to me about Cleveland. I'm sure that city has a pretty special place in your heart.
Sure. Yeah. And what's funny about Cleveland was my dad and I have this tradition where we go to a different baseball stadium every year. We've been to, I think, 23 of them now. And I love this tradition. I think we're going to go Oakland this year. I think Oakland is the plan this year because Oakland Stadium might not exist after this year. So we're going to have to check that out. But ironically or coincidentally, we had been to Cleveland the year before. We went to Progressive Field. And then a few months later, this is 2009, a few months later, this is when my agent said, what would you think about being an entertainment reporter in Cleveland? Have you ever thought about living in Cleveland? I said, well, I was actually there a few months ago. And it was just funny how like the timing of those two things came together. And yeah, Cleveland's such a special place, such great people. I'm a huge Cleveland Browns fan now because of my time spent there. I mean, it's not a matter of if you're watching the game on Sunday, it's a matter of where are you watching the game on Sunday. You go to the game or are you tailgating in the Muni lot? Because one or the other.
And so, from Cleveland, it was straight from Cleveland to Miami for Deco Drive? That was the next career move for you?
Yeah, I spent 5 years in Cleveland, and they were some of the most important years of my career. I mean, I was really fortunate there to be able to cover the Grammys, to be able to cover the Oscars, to be able to cover the Cannes Film Festival, to be able to cover the Moscow Film Festival. I reported from Hawaii. I reported from London. I mean, some of my biggest interviews happened when I was living in Cleveland, but I just knew that I wanted something more, and I wanted that next step in my career. And that was when I ended up auditioning for Deco Drive, which is this legendary TV show in Miami. It's been on the air now for 25 years on the Fox station in Miami. And they had an opening when their host, Louis Aguirre, ended up hosting The Insider. So he went from Miami to Los Angeles to host this national show, and there was an opening. And I sent my stuff and didn't really hear anything back. And I said to my agent, I'm like, I feel like this is a really good opportunity. Like, what are we doing here? Like, we need to do whatever we can to make this happen. And coincidentally, again, I was going to be in Orlando. I had a trip planned to Disney World, and Orlando is not that close to Miami. It's like a 3.5 hour drive. But I'm like, if they're willing to see me and like have me audition in person, I'll change my flight. I'll rent a car. I'll do whatever I can so that they can see me in person. I don't want them to say no to just my tape. I want them to be able to like see me in person. And my agent like pulled some strings and said, yeah, all right. They're going to see you on like Monday. And I said, all right. So I called into work sick that Monday in Cleveland, auditioned, changed the flight. Instead of flying out of Orlando, flew out of Fort Lauderdale. And long story short, ended up getting the job basically because, again, I was there in person.
Yeah, the Van Vliet maneuver.
The Van Vliet maneuver.
It worked again. And so, how much of a game changer was working at Deco Drive just for your career as a whole?
It was a big one. And I think it was also just uplifting for my spirits to like never have to deal with snow again. I ended up getting hired there right before Christmas and I started in January. So I skipped winter that year in Cleveland. And up to that point, I'd always lived in cold climates, Cleveland and Vancouver and Toronto. So it was so nice to like start my new life in Florida, like, 75, 80 degrees and sunny every single day. And then we instantly I had some pretty great access to some pretty awesome interviews that I did everywhere I'd worked before, but now because this show was so legendary, it got taken up a notch. And Miami was also a destination for a lot of celebrities. A lot of celebrities loved to do press there because they had vacation homes there. So all of a sudden, I mean, Pitbull lives there. Um, so does all kinds of celebrities have homes there. So all of a sudden, like every week, it was like these people were in your backyard, and we were able to do these amazing interviews at these incredible locations. And it was like, I don't know, it just felt like it was taken up to that next level. So yeah, a huge so it's 5 years in Cleveland and then 5 years in Miami. And both of those 5-year stints were so crucial in my career for very different reasons.
Mhm. And then the whole time in the background, you're slowly building your YouTube during all this, right?
Yeah, but just kind of like as a side gig. Like I would interview wrestlers here and there when they would come to town. A few wrestlers call Cleveland home, like The Miz or Dolph Ziggler. And then when I was working in Miami, I would just interview a handful of wrestlers, or there were a lot of great independent wrestling there. I would just reach out to the promoters and say, "Hey, you have so and so. It's going to be on your card next Saturday. Could I come in and do an interview?" They're like, "Yeah, sure, sounds good to me." And that was where my YouTube channel like kind of started to grow. But up to that point, my YouTube channel was just a place where I dumped the raw version of these interviews, whether it was with the actors from Twilight or The Hunger Games or Justice League or whatever. Like, I was really fortunate to be able to get access to these people as they were promoting these massive films. And I would just kind of take the video, put it on my YouTube channel. We would also air it on the TV channel. It was a great situation.
And so at what point did you realize that you could actually make money from YouTube and it could be more than just a place to put the raw interviews?
I realized, so I started my YouTube channel in 2011, and it was just through a random conversation with a friend of mine where I realized that Google AdSense even existed. I didn't know it was a thing. And he goes, "Yeah, you can put those ads on your YouTube videos." I said, "What?" I mean, I've seen these ads, but I actually get a cut of the money. He's like, "Yeah, that's how it works." And I went, "Hold on, what do I need to do?" He's like, "Just fill out this little form, put like your banking information, that's it." And I realized that they would pay you out after you got $100 in a month. And it didn't take long till I was getting paid out every single month. It wasn't a ton of money. It was $110, $130, but it was money I didn't have before. And then sometimes when I had a really big video pop off, it was $1,000 a month or $1,500 a month. And I went, "Oof, I think we're onto something here." And some of those wrestling interviews were starting to make like headlines. We were actually starting to like get news that were coming out of these interviews. And that's when I started to realize that while I was posting celebrity interviews and comedian interviews and wrestling interviews, the wrestling interviews consistently were popping with the views. And I went, I think we're onto something here with the wrestling. What if I could start to go out of my way to make these wrestling interviews happen? What if they weren't just falling into my lap because they were part of like the day to day work routine? What if I would drive a little bit to make these interviews happen? And that's when my YouTube channel really started to scale. And that was probably 2018. And in 2018, I did 40. My goal was to do 40 wrestling interviews that year. And up to that point, I think the most wrestling interviews I had done was like 18. So 40 that year. The goal was to do 50 the next year. I ended up doing 100. And then I've been doing, yeah, between 80 to 100 every single year now.
Wow. And so at what point then did you think that maybe you could take it full time?
There was a point where I had a few months where I was making more money from YouTube than I was making from being on TV. And it was a really interesting crossroads because my goal was to be a TV host. My goal was to work in broadcasting. But that was my 2004 and my 2005 goal. And it shifted so much. And now I was realizing that if you put a video on YouTube or a video on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, you now had the ability to reach the entire world. Whereas when you were putting a news report out on your TV station, whether that was in Toronto or Vancouver or Cleveland or Miami, it was only being seen by the people that were watching TV at that exact time in that exact location. So I was having a lot of opportunities that were being presented to me that I wasn't able to do contractually because of what I was doing with my TV job. And I just kind of went, I think there's like a lot of opportunities I'm missing out on here. And I just had a moment where I realized like I didn't move to a new country. Didn't pick up my entire life to move to a foreign country, if you will, to just be a local news reporter for the rest of my life. I wanted to dream bigger than that. And I had some pretty influential people in my life that said like just dream bigger. Like just don't be like content with what you have right now. Like dream for something bigger. And that was really what pushed me to see that there was opportunities outside of what I was doing. And it was difficult because I was part of an amazing show. I loved what I was doing. I had amazing coworkers and incredible opportunities every single day, but I just knew that there was something better on the other side of it. I just couldn't see what it was, and it took me leaving and pursuing other opportunities to go, "Oh yeah, there is a lot of stuff out here."
Are you able to share who those influential people were that kind of pushed you and like you should do this?
There were several of them, but I'd say the person who was the most influential was Tyler Perry. And I had interviewed him several times. And every time I interviewed him, he was just like, I think you should dream bigger. Like, I think there's more opportunities for you. And he was never saying, like, come work for me or anything like that. He was just saying, like, you're good, believe in yourself. And I at first was like, yeah, thank you. That's very nice. Like, appreciate it. But like, I'm pretty happy doing what I'm doing right now. And every time I would see him, whether it was for a Medea movie or just a Tyler Perry film, because man, nobody works harder than Tyler Perry. Every time I would see him, he would say, like, dream bigger, like aspire for something more. And he invited me to the opening of his studio in Atlanta. And I was there. I was there, with everybody, all of his friends and his colleagues and everybody. And I just felt like, oh my gosh, he's right. Like, there are so many more opportunities. So yeah, he's been really influential to me as a mentor, as an inspiration, and as a friend.
Mhm. Can I guess? I'm gonna guess those months where you made more money from YouTube than from your job. Was that, I wrote it down, April to July of 2019?
I mean, there was definitely there was a lot of those months.
Because that
Um, yeah,
because that was
that was
around,
definitely a big one.
because I checked Social Blade, 65,000 subscribers gained in about a 4-month time period, which is insane. And like, does that so was that would that be around the time where you were heavily considering the jump? Was like as the channel was growing, you're starting to make more money, and that was kind of the around that time when you made the jump? Or when did you finally decide I'm going full time on my own?
I think it was 2019 was just a really good year for my YouTube channel. Like, I was able to kind of capture the lightning in a bottle that was happening in the pro wrestling world at that time. And, I was able to get access to a lot of these interviews. Like, started 2019, I got the first interview with Chris Jericho after he signed with AEW. And that was a huge interview and a huge get. And it got like a million views or something like that. Few months later, because of that interview with Chris Jericho put me in touch with Tony Khan, and he did one of the first ever interviews with me, talking about what was possible for AEW. And I was just able to ride this wave of momentum that was happening in the pro wrestling world. A lot of it thanks to AEW, but it was an interview with Jericho, Tony Khan, Cody Rhodes, the Young Bucks, and then a bunch of other, my friends like uh, Jungle Boy and Luchasaurus. And I was just able to get all these great interviews where people were so excited about what was happening in pro wrestling and so excited about what could be next for AEW. And I was able to just bring them this content. So it was just a lot of me realizing that I was taking days off from my real job to go make YouTube videos, where I just started kind of looking at the writing on the wall and going, what's the future of my current job? And I don't mean that as like the specific show I was on, but what's the future of local news? And what's the future of this other thing that's fairly new called content creating, which is my YouTube channel, my podcast. And I started my podcast that year in 2019. What's the future of that? And I knew that the future for that one was quite literally unlimited. And that was when I just started to realize, like, I think we should just explore what the opportunities are here.
And you look at the two as, so obviously traditional TV is broadcasting, but you look at what you do as microcasting or niche casting, I believe, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've called it niche casting because it's the exact opposite of broadcasting. Like you watch a local news broadcast and it is very much that. It is broad, right? You've got a little bit of sports, a little bit of news, a little bit of sad stories, a little bit of happy stories, a little bit of weather, a little bit of entertainment. It's broad. It's very broad. And the great thing now about having this supercomputer that lives in our pocket all the time and consumes way too much of our time is everything you look at on there is hyper niche. If you're a big fan of knitting, your entire, Twitter feed could be like all of your friends that love knitting. If you're really into a specific type of car, if you're really into Mustangs, your Instagram feed is probably a whole bunch of stuff about Mustangs. And it's so hyper niche. And I learned through the process of my YouTube channel to niche down on that niche. I'd taken the idea of entertainment news, and then I was the interview guy, and I niched down into that. And then I niched again one more time into these wrestling interviews, and realizing that I was kind of owning that niche, at least at that point in time, that I was the guy who was getting these fun, great, interesting interviews.
And so bring me back to the first day you wake up full time doing your own thing. What's going through your head? Is it holy shit, holy shit, holy shit? Or it's just like a relief that you're finally here? Like, what's happening that day?
A lot of stuff happened in like a really short period of time. So it was really hard to focus on like what exactly was happening. So this is the end of September of 2019, the end of September of 2019, where I had my last day at WSVM, my last day after 5 years on Deco Drive. The very next day, I was flying to Washington, D.C., and I was part of the first episode of AEW Dynamite on TNT. And they basically said to me, "Do you want to be part of the first episode? Like, we love what you're doing. Do you want to be part of the first episode?" And it's like, well, how could I possibly say no to that? To be a tiny little part of the first episode of wrestling on TNT in almost 20 years. So it was all of this had happened so quickly. It was my last day at WSVN to then it was being on TNT. Then I flew from there directly to Atlanta for the opening of Tyler Perry's studio. And then it was back to Florida where I was selling my house and then moving in with my girlfriend at the time in Cincinnati. So it was like I had a lot of massive life changes happening at that time. And I don't think it was until a few months later when I was able to go, "Oh, I'm working for myself now." Because I was still just caught in that momentum of everything that I was doing at the time. And I've been doing a ton of interviews for my YouTube channel and consistently producing podcast content. But I don't think that I had really realized that like this huge shift that had happened because my life was still going like so fast at that time.
Mhm. And so now today, jumping forward to 2021, do you have a schedule or anything? Like what's kind of the systems you put in place around yourself as a business?
So it's 2 to 3 podcasts a week. So a minimum of 2 podcasts a week, 3 podcasts a week if we, get lucky and get another great interview, or if we just set up another interesting interview. So that's where it begins. It begins with the podcast, which and then also end up becoming YouTube videos. And then I'm auditioning for different TV shows now, and I'm hosting a TV show which should be out later on this year. So the cool thing about this, and this has been the cool thing since I started my career, is every day is different. No 2 days are the same. And I'm excited that I'm able to drive my day with the things that interest me every day. And the way that I define success is being excited for what you're going to do at the start of the day and then being proud of what you've accomplished at the end of that day.
Okay. And so I'm curious, have you built a team around you for like, do you have editors or producers or anything to help you with the show?
I'm so fortunate with my podcast that I'm with a great network called Blue Wire. And there's some really big things happening with our podcast network, Blue Wire. We're building a studio inside the lobby of the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas, which I'm going to start to do some podcasts out of and some interviews out of. So through my network with Blue Wire, there's an incredible team of insanely talented people. And I've kind of learned recently, and it was a difficult decision to make. It was a difficult process to go through because I wanted to be hands-on with everything in the process. And I realized that it's probably smarter to have people who are, more talented at editing or, graphics or whatever it happens to be, that the people that are more talented at this, they do this as their full-time job, or they take this on their plates. So my podcast is now edited by somebody within the network. My graphics are now made by somebody within the network. Some of the guest booking, they've been helping me with that. And because we've been able to all come together and collaborate on this, it helps everybody out.
And so, kind of pre working with them, what was your, or even today with the guests that you do get on, what's your process for getting guests on the show? What's that look like?
It's really just hoping and begging, and that it's going to work out. It's probably not unlike what yours is. It's you send out a bunch of emails and you kind of hope for the best. But in the process of sending out these emails, and you know this, Jacob, it's about like presenting this in a way that provides the most value for that person, because they're giving up their time. They're giving up 45 minutes, an hour and a half of their time, whatever it happens to be. What's in it for them? So it's positioning these emails in a way of going, thank you. I am very aware of how busy you are. I am hyper aware of how important your time is. So here's some of the other people who have thought it's been a good idea to be on my show. I would love to, also be able to add you to that list as well. And I get a lot of no's, or I get a lot of like no responses. But, every once in a while, like the interview I just posted today as we record this was with Chuck Liddell. And I'm a huge UFC fan. He is one of the most legendary UFC fighters of all time. And I got to do it at his house. He lives about half an hour away. So it was so cool to be able to go to his house, sit down and like have an in-person conversation with him. And for all of the no's and for all of the emails that don't get responded to, it's so cool when something like that comes together.
And so, when you're going to Chuck Liddell's house to record this interview, do you have people from your podcast network come with you to help set up the gear? Or are you a one-man show when you go to record a podcast?
I'm for the
live?
most part a one-man show where I record most of my interviews on my iPhone. Like the video is recorded on my iPhone. And then I have a Zoom H4n, which is recording the audio, and I plug in the XLR and the mics into that. But my buddy Zeus, who's one of my best friends here in Los Angeles, is a huge UFC fan. He also happens to be one of the most talented photographers and videographers that I know. And in fact, if you follow my Instagram account, any of the cool drone shots are all thanks to my friend Zeus. So I said, hey man, how would you like to go to Chuck Liddell's house next week? And he's like, are you kidding? I'm like, no, I'm serious. I said, but like, you're going to have to help me out. He's like, oh yeah, hell yeah, of course. So Zeus came with his equipment. He ended up shooting the interview and making it look great. So it was win-win for both of us. But normally, yeah, I'm doing it on my own.
So talk to me about where the comfort level of using your iPhone to record the interviews comes from. Because I feel like a lot of people, especially just when they start their podcast, they feel like they need to get the fanciest camera, the best mics on the planet. So talk to me about where the comfort level to just use your iPhone to record the video comes from.
Well, the video quality on the iPhone is actually really, really good. I would not trust the audio quality on my iPhone, but the video quality is really good. The reason that I trust my iPhone is because with most DSLRs, they'll shut off after 30 minutes. And as you know, most of our interviews are longer than 30 minutes. How embarrassing would it be that at the 29-minute mark to have to go, excuse me, Chuck Liddell, let me just do something here. Okay. And now we're recording again. So I realized that the iPhone doesn't shut off. Like the iPhone will just keep recording until you run out of space. So if you have 50 gigabytes free on your iPhone, you could record for like 10 hours. That was where I got the comfort level. And I could also point, I'm actually recording with the front facing camera. So I'm actually looking at us as we're recording the interview so I can be sure that it's still recording. And I've had a few moments, man, where I look over at the camera and like it stopped recording. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Like it's run out of space, or someone, like God forbid, has called me and I forgot to put it in airplane mode. So there's definitely been a few moments where I've learned the hard way that like the iPhone is great because you can record hours at a time, but also you need to take a lot of steps to make sure you're ready to go. You need to make sure your battery is charged up. You need to make sure you have a ton of space on your camera or on your iPhone. And you need to make sure that you are absolutely in airplane mode and that Wi-Fi is shut off, because any phone call will stop the recording.
It's very true. And has anybody ever left a comment on any of your content saying the video quality needs to be better?
No, not that I know of. I mean, I also think though that we live in a world now where we're so used to seeing like shaky vertical video that I feel like if the quality is not great, people get over it after like 2 minutes.
And that's why I asked that question, because I feel like people stress so much about having like the highest quality level. While it does matter to an extent that you're putting forward the best interview you can, if you can't shoot something that looks like it was shot in a TV studio, that's not the end of the world. People will still consume your content, especially I found after COVID, where people became used to listening to podcasts that have been recorded on Zoom, where there's going to be audio glitches, there's going to be little things. People are used to that. So it doesn't have to be the highest quality content. You don't need to go buy a red camera and the best quality mics. Like you can start a podcast today on your phone if you have to, if that's all you
Yeah,
have.
and I think a lot of people end up using the equipment as an excuse. They use it as an excuse to not start. They're like, well, I would have this great podcast, but I can't afford to buy that microphone. Or I would have this great podcast, but I mean, cameras are just so expensive. And I just say to those people, just start. Like the camera quality on your iPhone is very good. The audio quality is good enough. Just hit record and start. And just know that nobody's going to be listening to your first bunch of podcasts anyway. That's how it works.
There you go. Exactly. And so once you get one of your guests booked on the show, what's the prep process look like for you?
So I like to start out with like a skeleton of like, who is this person? Like, what have they done in their life? If they're an actor, like, where did they grow up? Where did they get training? What was their first role? If they're a wrestler, it's like, where did they get signed first? Did they have a tryout match for WWE? I want to get like a skeleton of like beginning to their current stage right now. And Wikipedia is actually a really great place to start with that, just to kind of like get a skeleton of, all right, this is where their life is and where they've been. I'll also type their name into Google News and go, oh, so like what's the latest with this person? Is there something that's really newsworthy about them that maybe they haven't spoken about? And maybe we could get them to open up about that. I'll also type their name into YouTube and see what the autofill suggestions are. So you type in someone's name like Chuck Liddell, for example, and then you see like, oh, a lot of people are searching Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. Maybe we should talk to him about that. So I'll just kind of get a feel for like, who is this person? What are they all about? I'll listen to some of their interviews to get a feel for like the types of questions that they answer and then just kind of go from there. And I don't ever want to think about it as an interview. I want to think about it as a great conversation. And I mean, you're a pro at this. You're a pro at like making these interviews sound like conversations. And it is not an easy task. It is a great skill that you've acquired. So my hat's off to you, even though I'm not wearing a hat. My hat's off to you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And speaking of the conversations, one thing that I noticed, because I watched some of your interviews, obviously to prep for this one, you don't have cue cards as far as I could tell in any of your interviews at all, right?
I do and I don't. It depends on the interview. Usually, what I'll do is I'll start to make notes on my iPhone, like in the notes section of the iPhone. I start to like make like bullet points of like these are the 10 or 15 or 20 topics that I think we should cover. And then usually the day of the interview, I physically write it out on a piece of paper so that I get that connection of my brain to like my hand to the paper, which I don't know, just forms like a better bond between those subjects. And what I'll often do is I'll write them on like a little like cheat sheet and put them like on the floor or put them like under my leg as I'm sitting. But oftentimes I don't even look at it. So it's there kind of as like a safety blanket, like a security blanket. But yeah, usually I'm just following the flow of the conversation.
That's fair. And I feel like even just following the flow of the conversation can be a difficult thing, especially for new interviewers to
Oh,
do,
yeah.
because they, once they have prep, and like I've fallen into this trap many times, mainly because I'm so thorough with my prep. Like, let me just see here. I have 12 pages of notes here for this interview.
Wow.
And so it's like, because I spent the time, it's like sometimes I just want to follow what I have, but like, I feel like people miss so many good things when the conversation veers a direction, but they pull it back to what they have in their notes versus might be going somewhere you had no idea where it was going. And kind of on that note, what if I ever ask you, what interview comes to mind where it went completely sideways in a direction you didn't expect, but it was a really good thing that it went there?
I mean, the one that immediately comes to mind was like this viral interview with Leslie Mann and Dakota Johnson, where I went in to talk to them about their movie, How to Be Single. And I came in with some fun, like lively questions, and they kind of guided the conversation in a completely different way and like kind of started hitting on me. And I'm like, let's see how far we can push this. Let's see where this is going to go. And it ended up becoming a viral moment that I'm still like tagged in I was tagged in on like a video of this on TikTok like yesterday. Basically like they're hitting on this reporter. And I'm like, that happened 5 years ago. But if I had gone in and was like, yeah, nice to meet you. Aha, this is very fun. Ha ha ha. Like, but anyway, ladies, I have these questions I'd like to ask you. It wouldn't have been a fun, memorable moment. So I just kind of rolled with the punches and went, let's see what can happen here. And I also think there's moments in interviews where I've kind of followed the path of that conversation and it's led to news breaking that I didn't even realize was breaking. Like I did an interview with Jason Momoa for Aquaman and he just happened to say something off the cuff about the Snyder cut. And I didn't even really think about it, but the conversation just kind of led down there. And when I posted the interview, all the comments on it were about the Snyder cut and I went, "Oh, we were onto something here. Like that's so cool that question like led down that path."
And so I'm curious because obviously to get people to feel comfortable to share stuff like that in an interview, you have to build rapport. So how do you build rapport with someone pre-interview, but also balance that you don't want the pre-interview rapport building to lead somewhere that you wish was on the podcast that's going to be awkward and forced if you were to bring it up again on the podcast? Like, how do you build rapport with your guests when you sit down to do a show?
I just try to keep in mind that the interview begins not when you hit record, but it begins like the second that you walk in the room. If it's a in-person interview, or if it's something like this where it's virtual, the interview begins like the second you see that person. And I think that a lot of interviewers like make the mistake of like walking into the room, shaking, "Oh, it's nice to meet you," shaking the hand, then sitting there and waiting until the red light comes on and then like, pepping up and like doing the interview. And like that's not a normal thing. Like that's not how like real life would work or function. So I try to come in, especially when you're doing a celebrity interview and they're doing 30, 40, 50 interviews in a day. I try to come in like with a different kind of energy because if my energy can be high and fun, I'm hoping that maybe if they can't match my energy, maybe it peps them up just a little bit. So that's been my thing is just like try to have fun. And I also like swing for the fences, especially with celebrity interviews. I'll swing for the fences and try to get like a really fun moment. And if it doesn't happen, nobody needs to know that it doesn't happen. Like I asked Gerard Butler if he would show me how to do a movie punch. And I'm like, man, if we can pull this off, it's going to be so cool. Like here he is like swinging and missing my face by like 2 feet, but at the same time, I'm timing it. If we can make this happen, great. If he says, no, sorry, man, I don't do that kind of thing. I go, okay, yeah, no worries. And the only people that need to know that happened or didn't happen is me and him and the camera guy and then the audio guy. But if it does work out, it's this great moment that can be shared, online for years to come.
That's kind of perfect because it leads me to my next question with how does it differ with a press junket where you have 4 minutes versus an interview where you go to Chuck Liddell's house and you have an hour? Like how does your mentality change when you sit down and do the interview? Because obviously in the Chuck one, you're probably not going to sit down and swing for the fences within the first 4 minutes of the interview.
Yeah.
But it's like, how does your approach change when you sit down for 4 minutes versus like an hour interview?
They're two completely different conversations and two completely different interviews. And when you do a press junket, knowing you only have 3 or 4 minutes, which is 3 or 4, maybe 5 questions, I actually plan out those questions. And, I'll still like follow the conversation. If it goes this way, we'll go with it. But I'll physically write out like word for word what those questions are because, time is of the essence with those. When you're doing a full podcast interview, whether it's in person or it's virtually, you've got 45 minutes, an hour to like ramp up to those conversations, to like have a runway to get to certain topics. Like the first 4 minutes of a 45-minute podcast are just like the getting to know each other, like just the pleasantries. And I feel like you've got the opportunity to like, if they bring up a subject, you can really dive deep into that subject and like get all the stories out of it. So for the press junket interview or the red carpet interview, I'll physically write out actual questions. For a longer interview, I'll just write out the topics and I write them out maybe in an order I think that it might go, but we might go like question number 1 or topic number 1 to like topic number 12 to number 4. And you just kind of bounce all over the place. But as you know, when you do enough research, you're aware of what that person is talking about, that you can follow the conversation wherever it happens to go.
Exactly. Like I feel like because I've listened to so many interviews, watched so many things, read so many articles, like wherever it's like I have the notes, but just the process of doing the notes kind of ingrains it in my brain. So it's like I don't need to use it quite as much because once I hear like with almost everyone, I can tell where they're going based off of kind of the cadence of how they're talking because they answered the similar questions similar
Yeah,
ways.
and you're probably like, and I know this feeling as an interviewer. You're probably like, oh man, I've heard that exact same answer with those exact same words before. But it's like, this is the story. Like this is the way that that person tells the story. And yeah, it's interesting when someone like when you open that door a little bit and they like kick the door in with the answer that they give. It's like it's an exciting thing as an interviewer.
No, 100%. And so I'm curious, what would you deem as harder, doing a 45-minute podcast or doing a 4-minute press junket? Because I feel like most people would say the 45-minute podcast is way harder because it's longer. But if you have 4 minutes, you probably have to be like dialed in with those 4 minutes. Like you said, time is of the essence. So from your opinion, what's harder?
If all things were being equal and it was the same person and they were in a great mood and they were really happy about what they wanted to promote, the 4-minute interview is infinitely harder because you take those 4 minutes and put them into your 45-minute interview. Those 4 minutes are probably one subject or half of a subject. If you're doing this 4-minute interview and you want to promote their movie, book, album, whatever it happens to be, you've got to like formulate your questions of like, all right, I'm probably going to ask something like right off the top that's very like complimentary and like, we can get a good sound bite about the thing they want to promote. Then we can maybe dive into like their character a little bit. Then maybe we could talk about, is there a possibility for a sequel or something? I don't know. Like you really have to like formulate those questions. With the 45 minutes, man, you can jump all over the place with it. As so, yeah, I haven't done a short interview in a while. I had John Cena on the show a few weeks ago, and he was doing all like 4-minute interviews to promote Fast and Furious 9. And Universal was so kind. Universal Pictures was so kind to give me a 10-minute slot with him, which was like, and it felt like an eternity compared to what some of my colleagues were getting. But at the same time, it also didn't feel like it was long enough at all.
Yeah. And so how do you I mean, this probably doesn't apply to the press junket because they're kind of rotating in and out, like they're gonna be with you and then they're gone. But in a podcast setting, how do you kind of continue that rapport with your guest once the interview's over? Because similar to where you don't want to sit there, wait for the interview to start, and then perk up, like you don't want the energy to just die as soon as you stop recording. So how do you kind of build that relationship once the interview's over?
I mean, I think you just have to read it, right? You have to read that situation. Like sometimes they're just there to promote their thing, and that's it. But sometimes they'll repost you on Twitter or on Instagram, and you realize, oh, we've got like a bit of a rapport here. Oh, they started to follow me on Instagram or follow me on Twitter. I think though, if you can build a good rapport during that interview, that's maybe someone you could reach out to later on if you wanted them back on the show or if you had a question. But I don't ever think about those in like terms of like, can this be a long-term relationship? If it turns into that, great, but there's definitely no pressure to make that happen.
Mhm. And so when you what's kind of like your personal schedule? You're saying you're doing 2, maybe 3 podcasts a week. Like, how do you keep up with that schedule? Like, how does that like, how long does it take for you to prep for an interview? And then how long does it take to do the recording process? I'm assuming having an editor helps, but like, what does that whole like a week in your life look like to put out these episodes?
Man, every week is so different, but I like to at least look at the week like on the Sunday, I'll look at the week ahead and go, all right, cool. We've got this interview on Monday and this interview on Thursday. I usually record most of like the meat and potatoes of it, the intro and the outro and all that stuff on Friday so that my editor, Donald, who is supremely talented at what he does, he has all the information over the weekend and can have this ready to go for Monday night because my podcast usually goes live Tuesday at midnight. So like Tuesday at like right at 12 o'clock Pacific time. So it's usually like it's all leading up to Friday. It's all leading up to do we have everything ready to go for Friday of that week? And then we just rinse, lather, repeat for the next week.
How are you going to find time to take a break? Because with social media and YouTube and podcasting, it feels like as soon as you take a break for like 2 weeks, you become irrelevant right away because things move so quickly. So how are you going to balance having to put out 2, 3 interviews every single week, but also wanting to take a break, but feeling like you can't? It's like an endless repeating cycle every single
It
week.
is. Yeah. And like I have to put out like 2 episodes a week, like contractually. So I think that if I were to take a break, like if I were to go on an Alaskan cruise or something and didn't have like access to great internet, I think it would be like, let's just put a bunch in the bank. And that's the cool thing. Like, it doesn't matter if I recorded this interview this week. I could record, that's the cool thing. I could record 10 of them at a time, have them all ready to go, have them all edited. So I think that that's probably what I would do. I would do a whole bunch of work up front to be able to appreciate the time off because I I like time off. I think that that's actually one of the big pitfalls of this entrepreneurial life that so many people are like striving to live. I think I prioritize sleep. I think that sleep is so important. How could you possibly be productive if you're only sleeping 3 or 4 or 5 hours a night? Like you can't burn the candle at both ends. So I think it's so important to get like quality sleep. I go to the gym every morning for the most part. I think it's so important to like take care of your body. And like as much as I love pizza and chicken wings, I'm aware that I can't eat them all the time. So it's all about balance and it's all about finding time for the things that are most important to you.
Do you operate with a few weeks runway normally? Like if you record an episode tomorrow, is it going to come out in 2, 3 weeks, or are you week to
Yeah.
week right now?
Yeah. For the most part, I think I have 6 or 7 in the can right now. What about you?
So normally I try to leave 4 to 6 weeks between interviews. I think with just summer happening and everything opening back up, like I've had a tough time getting people to come on the show recently. Like I feel like it always comes in waves. I'll send emails and I'll get all yeses back, or I'll spend 2 weeks and get nothing. And so I have a 2 week runway right now. Like I think this will be coming out on, for context, I think the 12th of July, which is like a really short runway for me normally. Like I try to at least have that month, just in case I miss a week or something like that. Like that's not the end of the world because I'm on almost a 3-year streak of episodes every single Monday morning, and so I'm just committed to not letting that go by me. So yes, I try to answer your question. I try to have a little bit of a runway, and I'm curious if you do you ever study other interviewers and try and see how other people tackle interviewing people? Is that something
Yeah,
you do?
absolutely. That was a big part of my life when I was growing up and trying to, become better at this. And you look at people who are the best, like Oprah or like Joe Rogan's become an incredible interviewer. But what's funny is Joe Rogan was actually one of the broadcasters I looked up to before I even got into broadcasting. I remember being in college and watching Fear Factor because I just thought he was such a great casual, like conversational host. While so many hosts in that time, and we're talking like the early 2000s, were very much like, hello, everybody, and welcome to Fear Factor. Today's contestants. Like that was how they were. And Joe Rogan just felt like he was your buddy, like talking to you over a beer. And I always wanted to be that style of interviewer. And actually, you'll appreciate this as a Canadian, but George Stroumboulopoulos is the very best at this. Like George Stroumboulopoulos is such a great conversationalist. And I very specifically use that word conversationalist rather than interviewer because that's what he is. Like George Stroumboulopoulos is so, so good. And I remember going to a taping of The Hour a few times actually. And I was fortunate to meet him a handful of times and just like to pick his brain a little bit of his process. And it's just very much like, I'll learn as much about this person as I possibly can, and then we'll just chat. And so it's people like that who I look up to, and I still look up to. I listen to Oprah's podcast all the time, Soul Sessions. I'll listen to like the School of Greatness with Lewis Howes. I think he's a great interviewer. I think Ed Milet on the Ed Milet show is another just great interviewer. And you don't need to have like the chops of a broadcaster to be a great interviewer. You just need to have the ability to be interested and then a great listener. Those are the two qualities you need to be a great interviewer.
And so what differentiates a conversationalist versus a really good interviewer?
I think the interviewer thinks of it as an interview. And I think a conversationalist thinks of it as a conversation. And I think that sometimes, especially when you're just starting out, you psych yourself out by thinking of that word interview with a capital I. And I think that instead, you just got to think about it as a conversation between two people. If you and I went out for a beer tonight, we would just chat. You wouldn't be like, okay, I'm going to say this. And then Jacob's going to say this. And then when he's done saying that, I'm going to say this. And I think that people often like do that way too much. And I think that that's the difference. And that's what makes the greats, the greats.
Mhm. So I know we've covered a lot here, but what would if you could distill down to one point, what would your advice be to someone just starting out, just starting to interview people, just starting their podcast? What would your advice be to that person?
Just start. That is the most important thing. It's just start, because a lot of people have this great idea for a podcast or a great idea for a YouTube channel, and they'll talk about it and they'll dream about it, but they'll never actually like put one foot in front of the other and actually start. So I think it's important to hit record and put it out into the world, and then do it again next week, and then do it again the week after that. And if you keep showing up, your audience will start showing up as well. So I think it's just so important to put one foot in front of the other and to do it, and find somebody who's doing the thing that you love doing. Find somebody who like can model after them. Like Tony Robbins always says, success leaves clues. And it's so true. So find the person that's doing the thing that you want to do, reverse engineer where they're at back to where you're at. Maybe they're at step 67, you're at step 1. Figure out what step 66 is, 65, 64, all the way back to where you are. And you'll realize that you have a lot more in common with that super successful millionaire slash billionaire than you thought.
Now, this is my selfish question. I think it's always important to learn from the best. So I want to ask you, after spending an hour and a half of time with me, is there anything specific that you've identified that you think I can do better?
Better. You were great, man. And it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. And I think that, well, I've done a lot of interviews where I've been on this side of the mic recently. And it's a lot of times you're talking to someone who really has no clue about you, or in my case, don't even know how to pronounce my last name. So I think it is such a sign of respect that you have dove as deep into the research as you have. So I want to thank you for that. I appreciate that. It is a huge sign of respect. Thank you for knowing my story better than I know my story. And no, I mean, please, like I want advice from you on how to do this better.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Normally, I have a lot of quotes on the podcast, like quotes of the guests. I haven't had any from you, but I found an article that I wanted to ask you about. I have a quote here, and this is from 2016, and it was, "Who's on your bucket list of interviews?" And it is says so that the quote is, "Tom Cruise is at the top of my bucket list interview. There are a lot of actors, but there are very few legitimate movie stars left in the world, and he is unquestionably one of them. I have my fingers crossed that this will happen soon." Fast forward, that does actually happen. How cool is it to finally land that interview with Tom Cruise? I believe it was in Paris, right? With like the Eiffel Tower in the background. Like, what was that moment like?
So cool. So I'm like, well, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm thinking about it here. Up till that point, The Rock had been at the very top of my bucket list because he meant so much to me growing up being a wrestling fan. But then it was Tom Cruise. And I firmly believe that, even though I said that 5 years ago. There's not a lot of movie stars left. Tom Cruise is one of them. I would argue that Denzel is one of them, but there's really not too many other than that open a movie based on their name alone. So when I found out that we were being considered for the world premiere for Mission Impossible 6, I was like, we have to do everything we can to make this happen. And then they were like, yeah, you're going to be invited, and it's going to be in Paris, and we can't guarantee it, but Tom Cruise is pretty good about talking to all the reporters. So there's probably a pretty good chance that you'll get Tom Cruise. So yeah, it really couldn't have been any more perfect. He was so present in that moment, looks you right in the eye. He's having a conversation with you, Chris, the person, not having a conversation with a reporter holding a microphone. And I watched it back recently and I just went, man, I'm just so grateful that he was so human in that moment. And he treated me with such grace, and his charisma was coming out of him. And while there were thousands of fans screaming his name and trying to take photos, he was very present in that moment with me for the 3 minutes that we shared together. And yeah, I'll never forget it.
How often do you take the time to reflect on everything, from the backyard wrestling days to dressing up as Hulk Hogan and The Rock for Halloween in college to interviewing those two guys themselves, to interviewing Tom Cruise, Vancouver? You've been all over North America doing this. How often do you take time to look back on the whole journey?
Probably not as often as I should. But when I do take the time to look back on it, I'm so incredibly grateful for it. I mean, you see behind me here, be great, be grateful, which is a phrase that's really guided my life. And I now start and end every day saying out loud 3 things that I'm grateful for. And I think that if you can live in a state of gratitude, how could you possibly ever be upset? If you're thankful for the things that you have in your life instead of being instead of thinking about the things that you don't have in your life. And I think about the kid from Pickering, Ontario, who had the fishing rod in his locker. And I loved fishing so much that I had the nickname of Fish or Fish Boy when I was in ninth grade. I think about that kid. And I think about all the big dreams that I had and the fact that I'm still chasing after those dreams. And I'm really, I'm proud. I'm proud of that kid for not giving up on it because it is easy. And so many people have done it. I've seen a lot of my friends or family members just take the job that's easy. It pays decent enough, good 401k, good benefits. I was never happy with that. I wanted to have something more. I wanted to strive for more, which is why I picked up my life and moved to Los Angeles because I just wanted more. I wanted more in every single possibility. But I think it's so important to answer your question to celebrate those little wins along the way and to appreciate those moments. And even like there's some times when I've been at some like really cool events or you're standing in front of the door that says Dwayne Johnson on it or Meryl Streep on it and you're about to do that interview. It's important to just like take a breath and like remember this moment. Like take this moment and put this in a little compartment in your brain that you don't forget because life moves really fast. And if you don't stop and smell those roses and stop and appreciate those moments, they're gone. They're gone forever, no matter what. But if you can remember those moments, you can at least go back and like relive them and appreciate how cool they were.
Mm. No, I love that. I think that's a good note to end on. So I want to know what's next for you. What do you got coming up? Hopefully, I'm assuming it's a dinner at Swiss Chalet, but what do you got on the horizon?
I hope it's a dinner at Swiss Chalet. I mean, I was telling you this off camera, but I haven't been able to see my parents in person since Christmas of 2019 because of COVID and all the travel restrictions to Canada. So, what's next is a very emotional journey home once the border opens up after July 5th. I mean, I'm going to cry so much, when I see my parents again. So, yeah, and they're one of the things I'm grateful for every single day of my life. Like they've been married for 47 years with this incredible example of like what true love and companionship is. So it's a trip back home and it's just every day like looking for the best opportunities in every single day and looking for the opportunity to make that day better than the last.
For my last question, and I ask everyone this at the end of every interview. I like to flip the script a little bit. So instead of me asking the question, it's you asking the question, but it's not to me. Pretend you have a crystal ball. You can ask this crystal ball any question. You'll get the 100% honest answer. What is one question you want to know the answer to?
Oh my gosh. Does every interview that you do end with like 10 minutes of silence as people sit there going, my God, how should I answer
Pretty,
this question?
pretty much. Yep.
I mean, that's so tough, right? Because it could go in so many different directions. But I think for me, right off the top of my head, I would have this crystal ball at the end of my life.
Mm.
And I would ask this crystal ball, did I do everything I could possibly do? Did I play full out? Like, did I give everything I could? And I would hope that the answer would be yes. Did I live? Did I love? Did I matter in every single moment of every single day? I think that's what it would be for me.
That's a great question. I love that question, but no one's ever asked that either. So I think that it's
I don't
always
know, what
good
do
to
most
get
people ask? Like, how long is my dog going to live?
it's like what happens after you die is a common one, or like different things. Like sometimes people ask social media related questions. What do I need to do to become rich? Different things like that. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I want to give you the floor. Where can the people find you? Plug anything and everything you got right now.
Thank you so much for a great conversation. I'm like super grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you. So I appreciate you having me on. And wherever people are listening to this right now, they can hear my podcast, which is Insight with Chris Van Vliet. And then on social media, it's just my name at Chris Van Vliet, VanVliet. And man, I look forward to coming back to the greatest country on earth, my home and native land, Canada.
Look We look forward to having you back, and maybe we'll have to have you back on the show at some point. I have so many other notes that we didn't get to. There's so much more we could talk about, but I want to thank you once again for taking time to be on the show. And I want to thank everybody for listening, whether you've listened the entire way through or you only listen to bits and pieces. I really appreciate you taking time to check this out. Everyone do me a big favor. Go and follow Chris. Go subscribe to his YouTube channel, subscribe to his podcast. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below so you can find it. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me everywhere on social media at the Jacob Kelly. Feel free to come and say hello. My DMs are always open. As always, today's podcast is powered by TrueFan. Thank you once again for listening, everybody. We'll talk soon.